In today's culture, truth comes second to committing the unforgivable sin. And what is the unforgivable sin? The unforgivable sin is telling the truth even when it offends or hurts. Okay? And you know why it's the unforgivable sin to tell the truth? Because it offends. If you offend somebody, then somehow you are doing something so much worse than telling them the truth. Ironically, most people are less kind to you or less kind toward those that are telling the truth because they are being less kind, if that makes any sense. They will feel completely justified in their social media attacks on you because you are saying truths that weren't very nice to them, which is far more grievous than violating God's biblical morality in many people's eyes. So one, the culture needs to get back to the basics of seeking God's truth. And two, the obvious is we need to abide by God's truth, right? All the while understanding that in our broken culture, God's truth is going to seem offensive to some. And three, we need to understand, and this is most important, that godly truth is not something that culture allows into it, but actually godly truth is the very thing that our cultures, and all cultures for that fact, are built upon. Let me repeat that. We need to understand that godly truth is not something that culture allows into it, but actually godly truth is the very thing that our culture and all cultures are built upon and are cultivated by. And that understanding is the first part of going back to the basics. And there's no better way of getting back to the basics than at the foundations of it all. The book of Genesis, from our reading today in the 2nd chapter. So in this reading we have God, of course, creating the Garden of Eden. And so God is working. He's working to cultivate, to grow this garden. You could say that Garden of Eden is itself a culture, right? And so God as creator is this first cultivator, the one that makes it all grow. And you could say, therefore, that God is the foundation of the culture. You all following me? And then God creates man in verse 15, and he tells the man to do the same thing that God is doing, to take care of this garden that God created, to till the soil, to cultivate it. So therefore, the whole idea of culture is tied into the very purpose for which we are all made, right? We're all made to be responsible for, to cultivate, to work to grow the gardens in which we live, the culture in which we form around us. Right? We're all made for that. Right? But here's the kicker. We just don't form it. We just don't cultivate it to our own whims and our own likeness. We don't do this because there's some things about the garden that are created by God and are there that we care for them, but not create them ourselves. And that is represented in the trees. Genesis says that in the garden, in the godly culture, in the godly cultivation we're entrusted with, that God has cultivated some trees to grow. There are the trees that are good for food. There are the trees that are pleasant for sight. And there is the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There's these 4 kinds of trees. So in the culture that is the Garden of Eden, the trees are the foundations, and these foundations, very important, these foundations are God's foundations. They come from God. Man did not create these trees. Man is responsible to help cultivate, to care for God's foundations to grow in the garden, maybe like a pastor or a church is responsible for God's foundations to grow in our culture, right? But ultimately, they are God's trees. God created foundations, not man created, but God created foundations. So therefore, in the trees, God has provided a blueprint of what we need for our culture. In the trees provided by God, that which we care for, we have everything needed for a healthy culture. We have the trees that are our sustenance, right? The trees that are good for food, right? Every culture needs to survive and grow and sustain its people. The trees that are good for food provide the sustenance, all the while knowing that all we have in this world, all we have in our culture, all the blessings that are a part of our lives come from God. They are not our doing. We also have the trees that are our inspiration, the trees that are good for sight, right? Every culture needs to be inspired, but also be pointed toward that which is excellent and perfect. These trees are God's perfection. These trees are God's excellence and God's glory. And any culture that directs itself to be inspired by that which is God's glory in its actions and in what it produces will be a culture that flourishes and will be blessed.